The Historical Society of the United States Courts of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit is pleased to bring you another in the video biography of distinguished jurists who have served the courts of Nebraska and of this nation over recent years. Today we're pleased to have Judge C. Arlen Beam of the Eighth Circuit, who resides in Lincoln, Nebraska, today as our guest. Judge Beam, welcome to you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
You were a country boy. You were born out in Stapleton, Nebraska in the 1930s. Tell me about that and that time and what ranch life was like in those days and what it was like being in school in the 1930s.
Stapleton is a wonderful little town right on the south edge of the Nebraska Sandhills. As a matter of fact, the South Loop River starts 9 miles west of town. And I think the population at its best was about 332 people, and my high school graduating class had 13 members. And all of my high school time was right in the middle of World War II. So we went to school on Saturdays so that we could be free to help plant the crops in the spring and so forth. And I thought a great education from a small town, although I think they struggled to hire teachers to come during those periods of time because the competition for other jobs around. We were an agricultural area, mostly ranch work, and the thing I most remember about the ranch is how cold it was in the wintertime.
I can believe it.
Pitching hay and rounding up cattle and so forth.
Did you ever think as a young boy that you'd be going on to college? Was that in your plans or your family plans? Or do a lot of those young people that you knew go directly into agricultural work?
Probably a higher percentage of them went into work, agriculture and otherwise. My mother attended Greeley State Teachers College, although she was lived in Stapleton. That's where she and my dad met. And she was bound and determined that all of her children would go to college. That didn't work out, but she was more determined that her sons would. And so I think it was sort of a given from early on that we would go to college someplace, probably Kearney State Teachers College or someplace of that kind.
How many kids were in your family?
I had 2 older sisters and 1 younger brother, and my brother also attended the University of Nebraska.
So when it came time for you to go to college, you kind of stepped up, so to speak, and went to Lincoln instead of Kearney.
I was fortunate enough to be awarded a Regent Scholarship and also had a scholarship from the Union Pacific Railroad, which had trackage into Stapleton, called the Carl Raymond Gray Scholarships, and both of those were good only at the University of Nebraska, as was a 4-H public speaking scholarship I had from KFAB radio.
Okay.
So it was a money deal, Professor Shagru. That was where the scholarships were good, and so that's where we went.
Well, that's the way a lot of us were in those days. We were fortunate to get some kind of scholarship assistance, and that drove where we'd go to. But the course that you took was decidedly a course directed for people who were interested in agribusiness.
Right. I went to the Ag College, the College of Agriculture in Lincoln, and that was guided in part because the KFAB scholarship was only good at the East Campus, so that's why I landed out there.
Now, the East Campus is a far different place today than it was back in those days.
It is.
And then it was more distinctly a rural setting than an urban setting. And we who were on the city campus usually didn't see you guys out on the Ag campus very often.
That was true. Well, you see where the University of Nebraska Law School is now was the dairy farm.
Yes,
that
indeed.
was a farm of Holstein Friesian cattle that were actually milked, and they used the produce of that to do the dairy store out there, which all of you city folks in Lincoln visited
And still go to.
And still go to every summer, right?
That's absolutely. What kind of things did you study in college?
Well, I had a dual major. By agronomy was my course of study, but I also took a lot of journalism classes, and I graduated with what they called a certificate in agricultural journalism. So my last year at the university, as an undergraduate, I had completed all the hours that I need, or most of them, so I spent that semester traveling Nebraska as a farm feature writer for the Nebraska Farmer magazine, one of our long-time...
The Nebraska Farmer, the premier agricultural journal in the Midwest, really.
At least in Nebraska, like Wallace's Farmer, Henry Wallace's paper in Iowa, and so forth, right. Sure. So I got to almost every county in the state that semester in a Nebraska Farmer car and a small expense account, so it was a heady stuff for a cowboy from Stapleton, Nebraska. I can believe that.
Well, as I read your biography, you didn't decide to go to law school right away. You were a person who, nowadays you'd call it second career, but in those days you'd probably be the oldest guy, one of the older guys in the class. And I say that as a compliment because it shows your dogged determination to do what you wanted to do when you finally did it. What did you do in the interim between graduation and your coming to the College of Law?
Well, it was sort of as you describe it, but not quite. My last year in university, the Korean War had begun, and I had an ROTC commission, was called on active duty, and I spent almost 2 years, just a little under 2 years, in Korea with the United States Army, and that began essentially right after I got my degree in 1951. I came home from there in 1953 in August, and I started Nebraska Law School in September of that year. And I had been married before we left, and Betty and I had our oldest son at that time. And so I went to law school from 1953 through May of 1954. In February of that year, Betty had some major medical problems, some surgery, and we didn't have, although I worked full-time and went to law school full-time that year, we didn't have quite enough money to pay the doctor bill, so we decided that I would drop out of law school and get a job that paid more than the $105 a month that I got from the GI Bill, plus the 80 cents an hour I got working for Lincoln News Agency in Lincoln. But we decided that I would stay and finish that year. I'm not really sure why, because I think when I dropped out I didn't probably intend to go back. And so I went on through and took the exams, and we then moved to Burlington, Iowa, and from there into central Illinois. And then later in that, I worked for a seed company in that area, and they moved me back to Lincoln in 1958. And as you've observed in the agricultural business, they merged with some other companies, and the company I was with is now part of the Cargill organization. But when that occurred in 1963, we decided that we didn't want to leave Lincoln, and if I had stayed with that company, I would have had to move to Belmont, Iowa, which is north of Des Moines. So looking around for a second career, I had a couple of ideas, and one was to go back to law school and finish my last 2 years. So I went down to the law school and talked to Dr. Dow, David Dow, who was the dean, about getting back in, and he pulled out my file and looked at it, and then he turned around to me and he says, "Where the hell have you been?" So I guess that was my signal that I was going to get back into law school. So I went back in '63, and graduated in 1965. So I contend that I have the record at Nebraska Law School for taking the longest time from beginning to degree.
You're almost a tenured student.
Almost, that's right. So that's the history of how I got to law school.
Let me ask you about your service in the military and the sacrifices that visited upon yourself and your family, and part of its role in molding you as a citizen. I mean, you're not a guy who waves a flag, but you have a reputation for being a devoted American citizen, and it's something to be very proud of. And surely that military experience must have been part of the shaping of your character.
I don't know about my character, but it did shape me, I think, shape my wife perhaps equally as much. My oldest son was 3 weeks old when I left, and he was about 2 years old when I came back. And I think that that's the biggest sacrifice that I made, and you miss those bonding times, and I think it took a little while, but I'm proud of him, and he's been great. And we then proceeded to have 4 more sons, so that didn't deter us at all, at least in the child business. But I think the military does shape your thinking, your philosophy, and we sometimes thought we didn't understand why we were over on the Korean Peninsula. I think maybe the things that we're experiencing today tells us that perhaps it was a more important assignment than we realized, and perhaps, I won't get into political things, perhaps it was an assignment that wasn't done, or wasn't done as completely as it might have been, and so our foreign policy might be a little different now. But the other thing about my service in Korea vis-a-vis what I'm doing now is that toward the end of that time, I was appointed to perform either as a prosecuting attorney or defense attorney on special court-martials, where you didn't have to be a lawyer. In fact, you probably couldn't be appointed to a special court-martial. But that sort of whetted my appetite for things of the law, although my research was done in a volume of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which was about 1.5 inches thick. So it was a far cry from the actual practice. But that's why, while I was there, that I decided that maybe when I came back, I'd give law school a try.
Yeah. Tell me about what it was like in the College of Law in those days as compared with what you know about modern legal education, and having gone to law school at about that same time at the same school, I have my own personal reactions and recollections and really fond memories of it. But in a lot of cases, people who were there who were veterans said, you know, I'd like to get this over with as quick as I could and get on with my life. What was it like in the case of Arlen?
Well, I saw a bit of a sea change between my first year and then 9 years later when I came back for my last 2, and perhaps more of a sea change now as my 2 of my children have gone to school down there at the law school. But you will recall that in the 1950s, you went to law school 6 days a week, because a good number of the faculty were practicing lawyers in downtown Lincoln, and they spent their mornings teaching at the law school and their afternoons pursuing their practice. So we went to, which worked out very well for our lifestyle, we went to school, as you recall, from 9 to 12, 6 days a week, and we had our afternoons off. So it was then that I was able to work in the afternoon, make enough money to feed my wife and child at that time. And I think, and then when I came back, they were on a 5-day schedule, and I think almost all of the faculty, except perhaps Herman Ginsberg, who taught conveyancing and the real estate stuff, were professional law school teachers by that time. I think there might have been a few other, what do you call them now, adjuncts,
Yes, sure.
professors then. And the atmosphere was more competitive, I thought, among the students. They were vying to be well up in the class and so forth. And a little more, the academics the first year were a little less pronounced. You either they told you, as you recall early on, well, look to the right and look to the left because a couple of you won't be here at the end of the year and that sort of thing. And but when I came back, the LSAT or the objective signs and symbols were in place, and there were fewer people that dropped out, and so it was more professional thing. I liked them both. I thought they were both fascinating.
Having had this experience that you had had in agrijournalism and agribusiness, were you thinking at all about agricultural law or natural resources law, what would you call it nowadays, or were you thinking more of being a general practitioner or just staying in Lincoln?
Lincoln wasn't a be-all and end-all at that time. I think maybe general practice. I was, by this time, when I went back after I was out, I had 5 kids. So what I was thinking about was getting a job and supporting those 5 children. And I think as many people getting out of law school, especially back then, where you went in the law was more perhaps a function of the law firm or the people that you were able to associate with and the kind of business that they had and the kind of business that you worked into.
Sure.
So the job that was available for me was, of course, with a firm called Chambers, Holland, Dudgeon, and Hastings. And Hastings is the Bill Hastings that was later the Chief Justice of the Nebraska Supreme Court. And they were trial lawyers principally and did insurance defense work. That's where I started, and then later merged my practice when John Dudgeon died. So I was looking for a job that would support me, and I happened onto the trial practice through them. And enjoyed it.
Were the kinds of things that you did while studying the law that shaped any of the decisions, people that you met as friends and classmates or faculty people or lawyers whom you had seen in Lincoln as you got to go around the legal community? Were there any kind of characters like that that you'd say, you know, I'd like to model myself after this guy, or I'd not like to model myself after that guy? What kinds of influences did you have along those lines?
I had, I think, great mentors. All of the people that I admired and tried to follow were the people that zealously represented their clients, but they did it with character. In other words, if they told you something, if they said they'd stick...
A lawyer's word was his bond.
Absolutely. I have a sense now from the arbitration sometime, if that's the right word we do, of between contesting lawyers now in the cases that we hear, excuse me, that isn't the paradigm so much now, or at least in some areas, but 90% of the lawyers you dealt with back in 1965 were honorable people. They worked hard for their clients, but it was not, you didn't expect surprises, and I liked that, and they were kind and you know, within the frameworks of tough litigation.
Sure.
And I think that that I thought made the practice of law wonderful way to make a living.
Did you work at all while you're in school for any lawyers? We didn't have clerkships so much in those days as young people have nowadays, but once in a while you have an opportunity to work for an attorney. Was there any of that in your experience?
I did not do any clerkships or working for law firms. As a matter of fact, when I started back to law school in 1963, I used my experience in the seed business to start a little company, a little consulting company on advertising and public relations, and so I ran that company for the 2 years, my final 2 years. My wife was the secretary and office manager, and I was the worker, so to speak. We had a little office in the old Continental building in downtown Lincoln, and as a matter of fact, I made more money my last year in law school with that little company than I made for 2 years after I got out and started.
You know, that's not an uncommon thing in those days at all. Being an entrepreneur worked.
Well, and so I didn't really have would have been economically counterproductive to seek it. So my very first experience at the law office, other than the work you did in law school and observing what was going on in court, was when I came into my office in the Stewart building with Chambers Holland operation, and there was this big pile of files laying on the front of the desk, and they were my cases.
How did you get that job? What was the process by which the association with the Chambers Holland people was made and gelled and so forth? Well, it wasn't a formal placement project like they do in law schools today, was it?
No. You just, by word of mouth, had an inkling of who might be hiring people, and you put together a resume with your background and so forth, and shipped them around. And then if you were lucky, you got a telephone call to come in for an interview. And it was my good fortune, I guess, with the Chambers Holland operation, that my former employer, a fellow by the name of D.D. Wainscott, was a friend of John Dudgeon's, at least an acquaintance of his. So they were looking for an associate, and he called Mr. Wainscott and said, would this guy be any good? And fortunately, Wainscott thought I might be able to cut the mustard, and so I went in for an interview, and they offered me a job.
Tell me what it was like to begin the practice of law. Were the lawyers in the first place good mentors to you in terms of helping you out, or did they just give you a file and say, go with it? Or how did that work in your office?
Well, it was a little of both, but only perhaps on de minimis kinds of matters that you would just be going it alone right off of the bat. No, there was a learning process, I think, a mentoring process. And in the trial practice, of course, there was discovery and depositions and interrogatories and picking juries and all that thing. So I went with mainly with John Dudgeon, who I might say I think was the best trial lawyer I've ever associated with, and that means from beginning to end. And you'd go to old cases and get interrogatories that seemed to work in those instances. And then you would go as sort of the second chair on the taking of depositions and trial preparation. And you'd second chair some trials, and then suddenly you were it. And my first case, John came down and was my second, and we tried a jury case in Lincoln, and My opponent at that time was a fellow by the name of Jim Bruckner. Mm-hmm. And so Jim was on the other side. You know that he's a very capable lawyer. Sure. So it was a good learning experience, and I happened to win the case, and so that was a good start. That didn't happen every time. And then as your associates, actually the partners, became more confident, and your clients became more confident that you could handle their work, you sort of begin to do your thing, and every lawsuit was a learning experience of one kind or another, and you just kind of worked into the job.
You have the reputation of being a man who's balanced his life well. In other words, you did the professional work in the office, but you were never afraid of doing public service work. You were never afraid of being a good dad. Tell me how you were able to juggle those balls and do each of those things well in your career.
Well, I hope I've done each of those things well. I think the most important thing to me was that I was a good role model for my kids, and that I was able to support them well. And I have to give 80% of the credit to my spouse. She took care of our son when I was gone, and when we were going to law school, she gave them haircuts and shopped carefully so that the money we had could make it. But I think that there is a balance that everybody should have. I've been pretty much an active church man all my life, active Presbyterian, and participated in the Junior Chamber of Commerce and other things like that, sure. The Bar Association and some other organizations. And we just try to prioritize things and not sleep very much.
When did you first get an inkling that you may be interested in transitioning from an active practitioner to a jurist? Or is this one of those things that just happens?
In my case, it just happened. Because I had this hiatus in my education and started in the practice at age 35, and I was working very hard to sort of catch up, so to speak, in those times. I really didn't think of myself much as a judge. I never thought in those terms. And I hadn't really, and especially not on the level of the federal trial bench, because my icons there were people like Robert Van Pelt, sure. Who I still believe is one of the great trial judges of this country. And then later, and toward the tail end of my practice, of course, Warren Erbaum, who I think is equally qualified, and Richard Robinson and others. But when Robert Denny became ill, he was, of course, the federal trial judge, U.S. District Judge here in right. Omaha. An acquaintance of mine who happened to be the governor of Nebraska that I had done legal work for and legal work with called me and said, would you be interested? Mm-hmm. And I said, probably not, because I have all these kids to educate, sure. And do different things. And so, to make a longer story short, there was a little persistence in that idea from other people that I knew who were in positions to be concerned about appointments like that. And so Betty and I talked it over, and our youngest sons, who are twins, were in their last year at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, and we thought that with that and with the what we had built up a little bit in the practice of law, that it might work. So I said, if you think that people will buy this idea that you have, go ahead. And as it turned out, I guess they did, and so I started in the trial business, the trial judging business. But prior to that, I had really no thoughts about the judiciary.
And yet you have persisted as a judge, not only on the trial bench but on the Court of Appeals for more than a quarter of a century.
Yes. A little bit more. I started as a trial judge on January 8th of 1982, and I guess what's that? 24. Close to 25 years at least. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. And as a circuit judge now since 1987.
The apocrypha about becoming a judge in the 21st century is that some people just don't want to go through all the process and confirmation and so forth. What was your confirmation like?
Very benign, actually. I think this is a happening of more recent times. This, I see it as viciousness, and when I began in 1981 during the process, I'm trying to recall. I think maybe at that time as well, both of the United States senators were of an opposite party that I was, and as the president, President Reagan. But I had known, of course, Senator Exxon in various ways.
In
Lincoln,
sure.
Yes. And so he was not opposed. He knew it was going to be a Republican.
Well, right. The president got to appoint
Right.
people of his own party,
Right.
sure.
And Senator Zirinsky was very helpful too. As a matter of fact, we came in for our hearing before the Senate on a Friday afternoon. The Justice Department people who were always involved in those things said, well, if anybody on the Judiciary Committee has a problem with you, you wouldn't be in here on a Friday afternoon because the folks go other places. And there was another district judge from our circuit from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Judge Jones, who has been in Omaha many times trying cases, and another district judge from California by the name of Cynthia Hall. The airlines happened to have lost her suitcase on the way in, and so she said before we began that she felt like a new bride. She had something old, something new, something borrowed, and she was really blue about losing her bag. Anyway, there was a circuit judge up for confirmation who they asked quite a few questions, and then we each got a question or two, and it was over, and we were off and running.
And just a very few years later, it came time for your confirmation to the Eighth Circuit. Right. And was that a surprise, or again, was it one of those strikes of fate?
I think the latter would be a better description. Actually, I wasn't sure that I wanted to move from the trial bench, and I still have the belief that that may be the better job of the two if you're a people person at all, because you have closer relationships with the lawyers who are trying the case, sure, jurors, witnesses, and all of that. On the circuit court, well, you have the lawyers out in front of you for 15 minutes on a case, and you do not see as much of them.
Yes.
But there was a vacancy, And the issue became whether the vacancy would be filled by a Nebraskan or from another state, because we had Judge Lay was still an active judge from Nebraska and had not moved to Minnesota. And so the Nebraska political people were concerned about that. And as a matter of fact, the White House announced that a lawyer from another state was going to be nominated. As it turned out, the Nebraskans, who were fairly close to the president, convinced him that that wasn't a good idea. So I guess they had to look around for an alternative, and I may not have been the best one, but I was kind of there. So they said, we'd like to have you consider this, and again I said, go ahead, and that's the way it turned out.
You, for a long time, you kept chambers in Omaha and not in Lincoln. You became kind of a road runner like our new Chief Justice in Nebraska. What was that like every day being on the road?
Well, it wasn't fun, although you see the district judge job was a vacancy in Omaha. Judge Erbaum, we had two judges in Omaha, two active judges in Omaha and one in Lincoln, and Judge Erbaum was there, and of course he didn't want to move, and he was senior, so he didn't have to. So if I took the job as a trial judge, I was in Omaha.
Sure.
That happened when house loans were about 18 or 20%, and
yes.
I had a little trouble selling my house in Lincoln. So I commuted just about a year, and as quickly as I could sell my house, and we bought a home here and lived in Omaha until about 1989. And I had an office here, my chambers were here in Omaha as a circuit judge, but you recall the Zorinsky building was jam-packed with other agencies as well as the court, and the building people of the court and GSA came and said, we can build you out of chambers in Lincoln for about half what it will cost to move people and so forth to do it here. At that time, my only two grandchildren lived in Lincoln. My wife thought that was a wonderful idea.
Indeed, she would.
So we transitioned to Lincoln. And I did that after checking with the airlines and their availability to fly to St. Louis and St. Paul, and became convinced that that was okay, much to my chagrin. All the air traffic has so now I'm commuting to catch an airplane out of Omaha.
Yeah.
But it was it's surprising how much rain and fog Nebraska gets that you don't realize until you have to commute every day on the interstate.
I can believe that. Do you ever get an opportunity to go back out to your roots in Stapleton and look at the vistas of rural Nebraska and have a longing for that kind of a life, or are you happy the way things have turned out for you over the years?
I have some yearning for being able to sit on the banks of the South Loop River and be less concerned with the problems of the law or problems of other kind, although Betty, of course, was essentially a Lincoln girl, and we like Lincoln, think it's a great town, and we loved Omaha too. They're two towns of a different character. I do go back some. Next year in June will be my 60th high school graduation anniversary, and so I go back once in a while for those. It's a small enough deal.
Well, I wonder how many would be at that reunion?
Well, there were only 13 when we graduated, and we're down to about 6 or 7.
Well, I see, that's pretty good.
Yes, they've been pretty long-lived people. I think that on our 50th, there was only one who was alive that wasn't present, and then there was a couple that had died at that time. We owned a real estate in Logan County until my mother died in 1995, and we sold it to some of our relatives. But I still have some really good friends, even from my high school times, that we visit with. So we get back maybe once, twice a year. One of my cousins, who is a longtime principal of one of the schools, their wife was on a state board trying to infuse economic development in the rural parts of Nebraska, called me 3 or 4 or 5 years ago about 10 o'clock in the evening and reminded me that she was on this position and they were trying to bring some things, and she wondered if I'd consider moving my chambers to Stapleton. And I said, you know, that's an interesting concept and one that isn't without some allure, but I'm not certain how my law clerk recruiting would work out at that location.
Well, what's happened to your children? Were any of them involved in the law? Are they in Nebraska? Whoa.
None in Nebraska. 2 of them are Nebraska Law School graduates, so they're involved. My oldest son is a journalist and teaches journalism and mass communication at the University of Washington in Seattle. He's just recently moved there from Indiana University at Bloomington. My second oldest son is a microbiologist and does medical education in Rockford, Illinois, for a large Roman Catholic hospital group of 12 or 16 hospitals. My third oldest son is a lawyer and practices law with a firm in Denver. And my other 2 are twins, and one of them is a lawyer, and he's in the corporate law business now in Savannah, Georgia, more recently 2 there from Austin, Texas. And my youngest son lives in Mexico City. His wife is a resident of Mexico, and they live in Mexico and have 2 daughters, and he's doing various things, mainly struggling to master Spanish.
So this gives you and your wife an opportunity to do a lot of travel.
If we had the time to do it, if I would take this senior status a little bit more serious.
Well, this is interesting because I notice there are a number of people who are in senior status who don't act like it at all. In other words, they keep a pretty full docket. They do a lot of interesting things in terms of service in other courts and so forth. What has it been like for you?
It's been pretty active. I'm probably working about 3/4 time. My wife and I have spent the last 3 years at least, January, February, and March in California, getting away from the cold Nebraska winters. Other than that, I've been carrying pretty much a full load, either in the 8th Circuit or in visiting in some other circuits.
Sure.
I've sat with the 4th, the 5th, and the 9th, and the 10th, and and I've enjoyed that. Although there are some circuits that are sort of out of the way in terms of getting there and stuff that I don't particularly aspire to set with. But that's been an interesting thing. So with what I'm doing with the 8th Circuit and what I'm doing in other circuits, it's about 3/4 time.
Well, you say 3/4 time, but that's 3/4 time for a senior judge, and as humans go, that's about a time and a half, I would guess.
Maybe so, but when I'm in California, I hook up with my office with my laptop, so I do a couple of hours of work a day there too. So, well, it's a pretty, with the travel that's involved, it's a pretty active schedule, yes. And I'm still doing things for the Nebraska Bar Foundation, a couple of projects for them, and some other law-related things, little CLE and so forth. So I'm finding enough to keep busy.
That's simply wonderful. Judge, thank you very much for this very enlightening and fun visit, and I want to thank our audience. This has been a program on behalf of the Historical Society of the United States Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit. Our visit today has been with the Honorable C. Arlen Beam, senior judge in the Eighth Circuit of Lincoln, Nebraska.